Hello, hello, and welcome to the Sport Geeks, our second live show in our four-part series preparing for the fantasy football season. I'm Andy, and this is Dylan, and we hope to have a good show for you tonight. Um, we're going to give you our top 10. We'll break it up 5 and 5 like we did for our quarterbacks, and in the middle, we will allow you to comment if you're watching live. If you're watching post show, that's fine. You can comment then anyways, and we will try and reply to you if it's relevant. We did last week, so I will make sure to do that again. Um, like, comment, favorite, subscribe, stuff like that, typical spiel. So Dylan, would you say this was easier or harder than the quarterback rankings that we did?
I'd have to say that going with the receivers this week was more difficult. Uh, if you watched the episode last week, you saw that Andy and I had the same top 10 quarterbacks, just in different orders. But receiver is probably the deepest position in all of fantasy sport, all of fantasy football. So once you get past the top five and out there, there's a number of different ways you can go depending on who you think will do well and who won't. And there's a lot of variety of reasons why you think some could do better than others, which gives us a lot of candidates to choose from for this one.
Yeah, this is true. Even though we did end up with 9 of the same 10 guys, I think you see the disparity between the you'll end up seeing the disparity we have where they are ranked, and especially at the bottom when we get to the bottom half it gets interesting for sure, especially when you get to round 10. And we will give you honorable mentions. We have a couple that barely missed that we wouldn't be surprised if somebody else had in their top 10, as well as sleepers, maybe people you didn't think about, or rookies, who knows, things like that. So Dylan, you get to start this episode first. Who do you have at number one at wide receiver for this upcoming season?
For the 2015 season, my number one receiver is Antonio Brown of the Pittsburgh Steelers. This may not be a surprise. He was number one receiver last year, over 1,600 yards, 129 receptions, and he's been a great target. We talked about Big Ben in our top five quarterbacks last week. Antonio Brown's a big reason why Big Ben can be so successful, and there's no reason to expect any different this year. I think they still have, with the exception of 2 games, they'll still have Le'Veon Bell. Big Ben, assuming he's healthy, will be there, and it's for the most part the same team. And I don't see a reason why Antonio Brown can't put up another mid-thousands in yards and a double-digit touchdowns. And I think he's, based on his consistency over the past couple seasons, I think he's a very safe pick for the top wide receiver this year.
I couldn't agree more, especially with that last part, saying that he is a good safe pick, because a lot of people are going to put other people up there like Calvin Johnson and things like that, but I also had Antonio Brown, and you have to think, durability, key factor here. We had Big Ben in our top five. Big Ben is a very good quarterback, gets the ball there. He proved last year. Brown, as he said, had 130 catches, 1,600 yards. Not many players get 130 catches, and that means the ball's coming to him. And as long as the ball is in his hands, he's going to get you fantasy points, and that's important. Um, as I said, durability, a guy that he may, touching the ball 130 times, he may get nicked up here or there, but so far he hasn't. And he has the capability of, once again, putting up a big season. The only thing that I could have against him is Martavius Bryant and Marcus Wheaton there, 2 young receivers, and Martavius Bryant was coming on last season later, but I don't think that's going to make a difference in terms of Antonio Brown falling out of the top slot in my rankings. Dylan, who do you have at number 2?
Number 2 is Megatron, Calvin Johnson, Detroit Lions. He obviously we all know he's been the top receiver for years now, and this year some, like ESPN, have him drop down even below, out of the top five in some cases. And personally, I don't see that. This is a guy, he had 71 catches, over 1,000 yards, and 8 touchdowns in what was considered a down year or an injury-riddled year for him. So he misses a couple of games, still has 1,000 yards, 8 touchdowns. It's pretty valuable to me. I think he and Tate will both do well in Detroit, helping Matt Stafford out. And if he can stay healthy the whole year, I'm not overly worried about any recurrences of the injuries. But if he can stay healthy, I think he can return to the form that kept him as one of fantasy's elite players for as long as he's been up here.
Yeah, you got it. I agree again on Calvin Johnson. He is the best receiver in the league. He's the best receiver in the league. Not necessarily the best fantasy guy, but he is the best receiver, and his durability has proven to be a concern lately over the last couple seasons. And an injury-riddled season, that raises a red flag. He may, when he's playing, there is not a better wide receiver to have. But you don't know if he's going to be playing the whole season, and that's important. You have to think about that when you draft him. You know Matt Stafford's going to throw the ball 700 times. So, Golden Tate may be taking some catches there, but they always throw the ball. They're not gonna change the way they play. Their offense is that way. It's a shotgun offense. Throw the ball 50 times, and that's new age NFL football. So I have Calvin at number 2. Even if he misses a couple games, you are going to have a top 5 level fantasy wide receiver. And if he doesn't miss games, he will end up being better than Antonio Brown this year. And I'm pretty confident in saying that if they are both healthy all season long. So I have Calvin at 2 as well.
All right, so on to number 3. Don't worry, we'll start disagreeing soon. This is where I put Dez Bryant. He just recently re-signed big, multi-year, millions of dollars to stay with Dallas. And his main, I don't want to say his main source of production because he's had at least 1,200 yards the past 2 years, but he is a touchdown machine. I believe that no receiver has had more touchdowns than him since 2011, I think it is. And I don't entirely see that changing. You can make the case that the departure of DeMarco Murray puts more pressure on him, but pressure is kind of where Dez Bryant excels. He's one of those players, he's open when he's covered. If you throw a ball to him, he'll go up, and chances are he's coming down with it. And a lot of times that happens in the end zone. And so he's going to be a great threat for Tony Romo and possibly for your fantasy team too. These couple picks coming up were a tough pick, but ultimately I think Dez would be where I would go after the first 2 are gone.
And we have our first disagreement. I have at number 3 Demaryius Thomas of the Denver Broncos. I think you look at him and he has arguably one of the best quarterbacks of all time throwing him the ball. And I know Emmanuel Sanders is there, and we may revisit that later. I think we do. So, Demaryius is a top flight receiver. He belongs in the top 5, and it's close between him and Bryant. But Demaryius is going to make up for all the touchdowns that Julius Thomas vacated this season going to Jacksonville. So you have to look at it that way. Like, without Julius Thomas there, who are they throwing the ball to in the end zone? They're throwing it to Demaryius Thomas now. So Demaryius Thomas has an opportunity, in my opinion, to pass Dez Bryant in terms of touchdowns this season because there's more balls to be thrown to him now, especially down in the end zone where he can excel. So I have Demaryius at number 3.
Demaryius versus Dez was a tough choice, and while I agree with what Andy says, it makes sense, and I think some of that stuff also works against him. Demaryius is my number 4 receiver, and Julius Thomas is gone. Somebody's going to have to pick up those yards, those touchdowns, but that also you can also say that Julius Thomas and Wes Welker leaving puts more pressure on the 2 remaining successful guys of him and Sanders from last year. And while Julius Thomas may be gone, Julius Thomas he wasn't entirely a highly touted, well, he was going into the season, a lot of people kind of saw it coming, but Peyton Manning being the great quarterback that he is, one of the best of all time, they could bring in, or they could use a tight end they have on the roster, and he could be plenty successful to fill in as a red zone target. I think Demaryius Thomas will be very good this year. Of course, Peyton throwing to him still has Manny Sanders on the other side, help take the pressure off. He'll get a ton of yards, over 1,000, barring injury, and he'll get his touchdowns. But I personally don't know if I'd take him over Dez. But ultimately, that's a call that I think you'll have to make on draft day.
Yeah, for sure. On draft day, you will have to really think probably in the beginning of I would say mid second round. It depends if you have a double quarterback start or you really value running backs. Depends on your point system. But I think when you after you get past the top 2 wide receivers, you see a little bit of a gap there, and then you have to make that decision. Probably in the second round, do I take Dez? Do I take Demaryius? I have Dez at number 4. The reason I have him there is because Tony Romo isn't as good as Peyton Manning is. Tony Romo's a good quarterback, but he didn't make my top 10. And Dez goes up and gets the ball in the end zone, but I don't know if he's a reliable player when it comes to staying on the football field. He seems like a guy that, is a slight risk in terms of him taking his job seriously and wanting to stay on the football field. And he's a good guy in terms of production, touchdowns, like Dylan said. I agree with the good things about him. I can't put him ahead of Demaryius Thomas there. I think it comes down to quarterback there in terms of an offense that throws the ball a lot more. And I think you're going to have a totally different offense in Dallas this year without DeMarco Murray. All of a sudden, you're not going to run the ball as much. And I think that may change how Bryant ends up performing.
To wrap up the top 5, I have Julio Jones. This was a guy I knew fairly quickly exactly where I wanted him in my rankings. I didn't know what order the players ahead of him would be, what order the players behind him would be, but from a fantasy standpoint, I love Julio Jones. We talked about Matt Ryan in the last episode. Andy and I are both fans. And last year he put up over 1,500 yards, 6 touchdowns is a little bit less than you'd hope, but he's going to get you the points this year, I think. And you would hope that Atlanta will be better. He does have Roddy White opposite him, and the running game is still a bit of a question mark. But overall, I think he's got to be one of the top receivers in the league. In 2013, he only played 5 games, and part of me thinks that had he played the full 16 games and put up 1,400 yards, I think I'd be able to make a better case to put him at 3 or 4. But ultimately, I thought about it, and I like Julio Jones at 5, and I feel he's a player I feel really strongly about could be very, very good this season, and even could finish above Dez or Demaryius if the cards fall his way.
If Matt Ryan decides to be, like we said in the first episode, if Matt Ryan decides to be elite, who knows? In the 5 slot for me, I have, let's look at my sheet here. AJ Green from the Cincinnati Bengals. I have him at number 5. In my opinion, he is the second best wide receiver in the league, behind Calvin Johnson. So that's hard to defend, but he is built the same way. I think if you put him with Peyton Manning, he's as good as Demaryius Thomas. If you put him with Tony Romo, he's as good as Des Bryant. I think AJ Green is second best wide receiver in the league. So to have him at number 5, I think you put him there. I have my knock against Julio, and I'll say it later. And AJ Green has this as well. Injuries are a concern. Green was hurt last year, and Andy Dalton is not that good. But I think in Cincinnati, you have a situation where Mohamed Sanu is not going to be a concern for me when I'm thinking of whether I should draft AJ Green or not. And he is their only target. So I think you look at it, and I look at it in terms of a Houston Texans for the last decade. Andre Johnson subtly has put up numbers that rank like top 10 all time on a terrible team in terms of quarterback play. And I think it's very similar here with a Cincinnati team. Matt Schaub was above average. Andy Dalton's above average. And I think, you have a running back based system in both places in terms of the Texans of the past 10 years and Cincinnati. And I think AJ Green can be that Andre Johnson for the next few years, and I think he just puts up solid numbers. So AJ Green's my number 5. If that is the break, if you will, if you're still watching, please comment below with any questions or your top 5 and any thoughts or opinions. Remember, if you do comment post-show, we will look at them, and if they are relevant, we will reply to them. So that's a thing. Dylan, you said you really liked Jones and you wanted him at number 5, and we kind of talked about this before before we went live, but I think it would be a good thing to kind of say on the live show. What was the deciding factor, not just your attraction to Julio Jones' abilities, but what made you really want to put Julio Jones at number 5 instead of an AJ Green or a Alshon Jeffrey or somebody like that?
I think Julio Jones, he's maybe not so debatably. I think it's pretty easily one of the best receivers in the league. And there's a little bit less disparity. He's in a good situation. We've seen him very successful. And I don't know, some of it comes down to quarterback play. I think Matt Ryan will get him the ball no matter what. He's one of those players. He does have the injury history that we saw, but if he hadn't, I would have strongly considered putting him right at 3. And I know some ranking sites do have him there. So putting him over, I'll get to Green a little bit later, but ultimately they came out of the same class, and you can make the argument that going to Atlanta with Matt Ryan's better than going to Cincinnati with Andy Dalton, but it's up to this point. I prefer Julio Jones, the one who was taken second out of that draft.
Where do you think I know I went into it kind of with Bryant and Thomas. If you were drafting on draft day, where do you think the 3, 4, 5 guys fall in a standard 2 quarterback start like we run?
Probably some point in the second round for me, personally, because I think if you're running 2 quarterbacks, you definitely want to snag quarterback early, and that makes quarterbacks rise up all the rankings. And running back, which we'll touch on next week, is one of the more shallow positions, probably the most shallow position in fantasy football. So you do want to address that early. if you're in one quarterback, you can take the approach that you can either be the first or the last and still be fine with a good, solid quarterback. But if it's two, you want to address that early. I think you only really spend a first round pick if you're probably the second half of the first round and probably only one of the top two guys, personally for me. And then at any point in the second round, you can make the case for, I said 3, 4, and 5 were really close to me. You can make a case for each of them. Going to be honest, sometimes the tiebreaker's bye weeks. And that's something, before going into a draft, you have to know what positions you need to look for, the depth, and who you're drafting with, and because who you're with can determine the board. If you see how the board falls, that can determine everything for the rest of the draft. And I think that's something you'll have to do by yourself, but you'll want to prepare yourself with good rankings and analysis prior to this.
So one would say drafting RG3 in the third round would be a mistake.
I don't know who does that. He probably took Adrian Peterson in round 1, though.
Dylan had a tough year last year. We give him you got to give him a mulligan. That's really, really bad luck. So, thank you for sticking through the first half of the show. We're going to start with the second half. As a reminder, you can comment below with any thoughts, and we will talk about them either post-show or, we'll reply to them later. So at number 6 for me, this is where Julio Jones goes. And I think when I get to this point, I thought to myself, this is where the gap is between a wide receiver. These guys are the top 6. In my opinion, I know these guys are the top 6. And then after that, it's kind of like, oh, crap. Who is 7 through 15? It could be anybody, really. You kind of are messing with fire when it comes to that point. Some guys are better than others, but Julio Jones is at number 6 for me. The reason that is because he gets hurt a lot. And I think that's a major concern for me. That's a red flag. I can't the knock against me is I value durability a lot more than other people do. And I want to have a player that I know I can stick in my lineup every week and be like, hey, Antonio Brown, I'm going to stick you in my lineup, and I know you're going to get me good amount of points every week. Where you have Julio Jones, who puts up good points every week that he's playing, and that's not every week. And that's a red flag for me. I think with Roddy White there, that is catches being taken away. And in the case of the other wide receivers, when I look at a Calvin Johnson or a Demaryius Thomas, they're better than Julio Jones because they're just better wide receivers. They're better wide receivers, so they're going to get more balls than Julio Jones is. So that's why I put Julio at 6. Definitely top 6 wide receiver, no doubt. But that is where I have him, is at number 6.
I'm kind of glad Andy went with this is the definitive top 6 and whatnot, because my number 6 player is a different player. AJ Green continues to slip a little bit on my list. I went with Odell Beckham Jr. The Rookie of the Year, 91 catches, 1,300 yards, 12 touchdowns, and you have to remember that these stats were put up over the course of 12 weeks without Victor Cruz opposite of him for a lot of it. And Victor Cruz will be back. That'll take pressure off. They added Shane Vereen in the run game. I think we touched on that, helping out Eli Manning in our last episode, because we were pretty high on him too. And Eli Manning is a quarterback who's thrown, I don't know if he's ever reached the 5,000-yard plateau, but I know he's been very close. And we briefly touched on which Eli Manning are we going to get, the one who's one of the best quarterbacks in the league, or the guy who you'll be laughed at if you have as your number 1 quarterback. And I think the combination of Odell Beckham Jr. and a healthy Victor Cruz fixing that running game, the Giants' offense could be pretty good this year. And if they get rolling, they might be hard to stop. So I think Odell Beckham Jr. would be a good choice at number 6.
A Giants team that's hard to stop sounds like a team that is capable of going to the Super Bowl. Geez, that's scary to think about. But at number 7 for me, as I said, Dylan and I disagree on that rift. But at number 7, I have Alshon Jeffrey, a guy that a lot of people thought was going to be really good last year, and was good, but not quite the hype. He didn't live up to the hype. So I have Alshon at number 7. I think the reason I did this was you got to think Brandon Marshall's gone. He's with the Jets now. And Kevin White's there, rookie they drafted. Matt Forte is getting a little bit older. And they have Martellus, but, that's just Martellus. He's a good tight end. And we'll get to that in our fourth part when we go over tight ends, defenses, and kickers. But Alshon Jeffrey is a very good wide receiver. He's young. He's only going to get better. And I think with Forte aging, they're not going to run the ball as much. And Forte touches the ball constantly all game long, whether it's running or catching the football. And we'll get to that next week. But I think with the departure of Marshall, even with the addition of White, Jeffrey is going to get more opportunities this year. And I think if he can stay healthy, he can be a solid number 7 option for you in your league.
Yeah, Alshon Jeffrey's an interesting one, but my number 7, Jordy Nelson of the Green Bay Packers. He's got Aaron Rodgers throwing to him, one of the elite quarterbacks. He's put up, 1,500 yards last year, 13 touchdowns, with 1,300 yards the year before. So he's been pretty consistent. I'll get to it before Andy does. He does have a bit of injuries in his career, which has caused a bit of inconsistency in the past. But if he stays healthy, Aaron Rodgers will easily make him a top 10 receiver, at least in my opinion. I think he's a good choice. Once you get into the later receivers, you might not have to take him as early as the quote sexy picks like Des Bryant and Demaryius Thomas, but you'll still get a high level of production out of him.
Jordy Nelson is a thing. Number 8 for me, I have OBJ, Odell Beckham Jr. I didn't want to put him in my top 10, and that's not because I don't think he's a very good wide receiver, because he proved that last year. He is one of the top receivers in the league. He is elite. But, you have to wonder, and I'm going to talk about a guy who had a sophomore slump as well. You got to think like Keenan Allen, he did not do well last year. And, Phillip Rivers and Eli Manning are pretty similar in terms of ability. So, I think you have to kind of wonder. I know Keenan Allen is not as good as Odell Beckham Jr., and I'm not trying to say that. But I think Beckham might have trouble living up to the hype in his sophomore season. He is a very good wide receiver. I think Victor Cruz is going to take some pressure off him, but also take a lot of receptions away as well. And I think when you look at this, you have to look at it in terms of fantasy value, not necessarily namesake. And in that, a reality here, I don't think Beckham just gets as many opportunities as he did last year. And I think Cruz takes advantage of that, and I'll talk about him later. But I have Beckham at number 8, but I'm not very confident in that.
Number 8 for me was an interesting one. I definitely expected AJ Green to be higher on my list prior to its construction. I thought going in that he would be in my top 6 like Andy's. But as I was writing down the stats, writing down my list, ultimately I just made the decision that I think I'd be more comfortable with the other guys ahead of him. And we've touched on this. I think part of that falls down to Andy Dalton as his quarterback. Andy Dalton's by no means a bad quarterback, but and he's certainly capable of having a receiver who puts up elite production. But I don't know. I just wasn't sold. If AJ Green can stay healthy, I'm sure you'll be very happy with your selection of him wherever you get him. But for my personal taste and when I was looking through the stats, the 7 guys I've listed before are guys I'd just be more comfortable with at that point. And you can make the case Andre Johnson and Matt Schaub, but I don't know. AJ Green could be in the top 5, or he could just be number 8. So I guess we'll see.
There is definitely not a risk factor in that, I guess, right? AJ Green, I like AJ Green. So not enough to trade Le'Veon Bell, though. And I was offered that this offseason in a keeper league. And no, I don't want AJ Green for Le'Veon Bell. That's not something that I should consider. And number 9 for me, Emmanuel Sanders of the Denver Broncos. I didn't want to do this either just because did I really want to have 2 guys on the same team in the top 10? And then all of a sudden I thought to myself, you could have done it with Green Bay. You could have done it with Denver. You could do it with, Detroit. So you could do it with either Denver, Green Bay, or Detroit. And when you look at that, Denver is the best option. With Manning and CJ Anderson's a good running back, and we get to that next week. But they don't rely on the run as much.
Andy, are you there? Well, we may have reached some technical difficulties. This is going well. You can make the case, Andre Johnson. I apologize for this awkward silence. I don't know where Andy is, but we seem to have encountered some technical difficulties. Certainly happened in the past. The experience with the Golden Sports Report, as some of you may remember, but most of you probably don't. And hopefully Andy will be back soon to pick up where he left off on with his number 9 receiver. Good. I guess till Andy comes back, I'll start spewing something. My number 9 was also Manny Sanders. I'm sure Andy was hitting the nail on the head when he got interrupted. He has Peyton Manning throwing to him. He had 1,400 yards last year after 700 in Pittsburgh the year before. We knew, a lot of us knew that he would improve, but we didn't know that he would be actually that much better. A lot of this is what we said about Demaryius. They've had a few departures, and some people are going to have to pick up that slack. And I think Peyton Manning will safely get the ball to both Demaryius and Sanders this year. And Emmanuel Sanders, if you take him, could be a very high value pick. The one that everyone's going to be eyeing up is Demaryius Thomas, but you never know. Emmanuel Sanders as a number 2 tight end. What am I talking about? As a number 2 receiver in Denver, could be a great number 1 receiver on your fantasy team. Andy should be back momentarily. He's messaged me on Facebook. So if you've bared with us throughout this, thank you. It's not always easy running a YouTube show, but we appreciate your patience. And I'll take this opportunity to say, through about 9, we'll let Andy finish when he comes back. If you have anything to say, please comment with your own thoughts, with your own rankings, your thoughts on our format, what you'd like to see in future episodes. I know next week's our running backs, and then we're going to touch on tight ends and other stuff. So whatever you'd like to see in future episodes, if you like this format, if you'd like to see us try something different, if you have your own rankings, if you like our rankings, don't like our rankings, like our show, don't like our show, tell us about it and tell us why. And we'd be very glad to hear it, because without viewers, we don't have a show. So yeah, we hope you enjoy it. If you like it a lot, like the video, subscribe, share it with your friends. And I'd like to thank you for watching if you've gotten to this point. Yeah, I should have done that slower because Andy's still not back.